pressure inside the ventricles lead to blood ejection into the aorta, into the pulmonary trunk. You never, ever violate that order. Depolarization, contraction, pressure generation, ejection. Never get the cart before the horse. Can't happen. So if you happen to have a pathology, some problem with depolarization, everything downstream has a problem. If you have a problem with the contraction, everything downstream from that. Yeah, Kim.
Could you repeat that one more time?
Yep, absolutely. I'll repeat this over and over and over. Depolarization occurs first, and in parentheses put action potentials, because that's really what depolarization is. Action potentials going across the membrane. Remember, all the cardiac muscle cells, all the atrial muscle cells are electrically linked to one another. Okay. Now there is an electrical resistance band between the atria and the ventricles, so there's really no electrical connection between the atria and the ventricles other than through the conduction system. Okay? But all the ventricular muscle cells, they're electrically connected to one another with those intercalated discs and those gap junctions. Okay? So you have depolarization, which will lead to muscle contraction. Once the muscle is contracting, it can squeeze down and pressurize the blood, whether you're in the atria or if you're in the ventricle. If you pressurize the blood enough in the ventricles, you'll eject it from the ventricles into the aorta or into the pulmonary trunk, depending on if you're the left ventricle or the right ventricle. So that's the order. And if anything happens to someplace in the order, everything downstream has a problem. Yes?
Is the pressure then equal in both the blood and the atrium and the ventricles?
Is the pressure the same in the
Yeah, 'cause
atrium?
like why wouldn't the blood also be
Yeah, boy, I sure wish I would have, when we get to a slide here, I'm going to bring something up. I was going to, I'm going to talk about that, and I wish I would have labeled this one slide for you. So, we're going to backtrack here. We have, what's depolarizing here? SA node. SA node depolarizes. That depolarization will quickly go across what? The right and left atria. They're electrically connected. And there are specialized internodal pathways to get that depolarization signal to the AV node very, very quickly as well. So we have atrial depolarization. So the atria have depolarized. What's the next thing the atria are going to do then? They'll contract. And when they contract, what are they doing with the blood in the atria? Generating pressure. What's that going to do? Eject more blood into the ventricles, right? Okay. So that takes a little bit of time. It takes about 1/10 of a second. And luckily, so we're depolarizing the atria. So they're being activated. So now they can contract, generate pressure, and drive a little bit more blood into the ventricles. Yes?
What term did you use for the fibers between SA and AV node?
It's called internodal pathway. Excuse me. Yeah, internodal. I-N-T-E-R. Inter means across, intra means within. Your book has a nice little illustration of it. Okay, so once we depolarize these atria, it takes a while to get the contraction going and the pressure generation to go. Luckily, we have a built-in rest period almost, and it's the depolarization going across the AV node. It's very, very slow. It takes about 1/10 of a second in a typical healthy AV node. And what is this doing mechanically? What is it doing in actuality? It's allowing enough time for the atria to go through the contraction, pressure generation and blood ejection into the ventricle phase. So this little delay that you get in going across the AV node, mechanically, it turns out to be important. Now, the vast majority of blood going into your ventricles during diastole, and that is in between your contraction cycles. So when your ventricles are relaxed, they're in ventricular diastole. The vast majority of the ventricular filling is during that relaxation period. And what does atrial contraction give you? Just a little bit more extra blood. It tops off the tank, so to speak. People can lose function of their atria and get along just fine, because the contraction of the atria give you an atrial kick. Now, if you're out doing high intensity physical activity, then that little atrial kick, that little extra blood that you're filling the ventricle with, that becomes important. And you won't have as much ability to perform at a high level if you lose the function of your atria. But if we're just sitting still, no, they're just not, that just doesn't really help things that much. Okay, so now we have depolarization wave. So these are waves of action potentials going down the right and left bundle branches. And then, and Kim and I kind of come to an agreement that this works out. And if you don't understand, she is absolutely right. She was thinking about the physical location. That must be a precordial lead. And I'm talking about axis of depolarization. And when you get to vector analysis, you'll go, oh, okay. Everything, whether it's going from here to here, here to here, here to here, anything in that 60-degree plane, that's a lead to plane that you're going to pick it up on. So, but the general rule is I don't care what electrode it is, as long as it's positive electrode, waves of depolarization racing toward it will cause the pin to deflect upward, and when depolarization races away from it, the pin goes down. Okay, and you're going to learn. Have you guys yet got your rapid interpretation of EKGs, ECGs, the Dubin book? Okay, you'll get it next. Is it next semester you have your ECG course?
Next year.
Next year, okay. Yeah, that is an interesting book that cardiologists refer to him as Dum Dubin. And Del Dubin, the guy who created the book. Medical students, PA students go, oh, thank goodness for the man. But I saw it's on your list of books. And because it takes you from ground zero to understanding about 75 to 80% of ECGs painlessly. And then you can understand the next 25% without pain, as long as you have a foundation. So it's a really nice book. Turns out Dubin isn't a very nice man, or he wasn't. So, you know, but, you know, you kind of hold your nose and use the book. Okay. Anyway, geez, I need to quit editorializing with that red light. Anyway, okay, so I'm going to run through this and then getting back to what Becky talked about with pressures. Okay, so the atria are contracting, they're generating pressure, leading to more blood ejection into the ventricles. Now the ventricles are depolarizing, leading to contraction, leading to pressure generation. When the pressure in the ventricle exceeds the pressure in the aorta over here, you eject blood. So you always follow that depolarization, contraction, pressure generation, ejection. Okay? And if anything happens to any of those steps, everything downstream is impacted because you have to go in that order. Everybody kind of cool with that? Okay. So, now, So we are in diastole. This ventricle is relaxed from ventricular diastole. And you see that, let's just stay on the left side here. You see that that left AV valve is open. Blood always flows from an area of high pressure to low pressure. Always, all fluids do. The pressure in that relaxed ventricle at rest is what? About 0 millimeters of mercury pressure. So up here, coming from the pulmonary veins going into that left atrium, the pressure is very, very low. It's only like 3 or 4. But guess what? That's a higher pressure than what you have inside the ventricle. So blood during this relaxation period is going to flow. It's going to flow through, and that's a one-way valve, so it's higher pressure up here than down here. So it's going to drive that valve open. Blood's going to flow in during diastole. Now, once again, you're going to have to go to that cardiac cycle, Wigger's diagram, and you're going to have to do the heavy lifting to learn this on your own. It's the only thing that I've found that for people to actually learn it. Now, I'll be very happy once you've gone through it to draw it out with you and go through it with you. But you have to do the groundwork yourself. I'm convinced nobody can teach it for you. So, but during diastole, so we're getting into some cardiac cycle. During ventricular diastole, there's a little bit higher pressure here. In that relaxed ventricle, it's near 0. So blood will flow into the ventricle. Okay, so here we have this atrial depolarization. That's going to lead to atrial contraction. Oh boy, look at the artist I am. I'm making the atria get smaller. That's atrial contraction. So it's pressurizing the blood. It's driving a little bit more blood into the ventricle with those atrial contractions. And this is how well we're put together. They're right and left atria. They're contracting near simultaneously. So you're filling the left and right ventricles near simultaneously. Once again, it's a side-by-side twin pump. Beautiful piece of engineering. Kudos to the creator on that. So, okay, so we're filling that ventricle. We're going to find out later that's called preload. Preload is how much you fill the ventricle just prior to the ventricular contraction. You're preloading it. Okay, so here comes the depolarization wave coming down the septum. So the depolarization wave is going toward this positive electrode, wherever it is, so the pin's going to go up. So what is that doing? It's now, you're now going to have septal contraction, and then this is happening so fast, so very, very fast that you think, how can this contract and then that contract? But, okay, so what's going to happen? This is the beautiful thing. Well, there's so many beautiful things here, is, you know, if you take a toothpaste tube, and what would you do if you want to squeeze the most toothpaste out in one squeeze? Would you squeeze it from the middle? No. Do you squeeze it from the bottom? Yes. Tell my son that. But you squeeze it from the bottom, and that's what happens with the contraction cycle of the ventricles. The contraction wave starts at the apex and goes up in a normal, healthy heart. You're going to be dealing a lot with not normal, healthy hearts, but you need to start someplace first. So what is this doing? This is like squeezing the tube from the bottom up. So this ventricle is just now starting to contract. We've just left ventricular diastole. We are, as soon as this AV valve slams shut, that's the signal that we are now in ventricular systole. You'll see from the Wigger's diagram. So this valve is shutting. Why is it shutting? They're one-way valves. If the pressure of the blood in the ventricle is greater than the pressure of the blood in the atrium, that's going to slam that valve shut. And that just happened. And I wish I would have timed this a little bit better. So we have AV valve closure, and for a period of time, both the AV valves will be closed and the aortic valve will be closed. And we have a period of what's called isovolumic contraction. Isovolumic contraction. There's no blood coming in, no blood going out. So you're generating pressure, and you have to generate enough pressure to overcome the pressure here in your aorta. And once you're at a higher pressure in your ventricle than in the aorta, then that aortic valve will spring open. Okay? And that's the beginning of the ejection phase of ventricular systole. So the pressure in here, and this is getting at, Becky was talking about pressures. When you started, what was the pressure in that ventricle? It was 0. But let's say a person who has a blood pressure of 120 over 80. What's going on here? This person's blood pressure in the aorta had dropped all the way to 80, and as soon as this ventricular pressure exceeds that, that aortic valve is now going to be forced open. You're going to have blood ejection, but this ventricle continues to contract. It's continuing to generate pressure. So you have some ejection, but you have continuing pressurization of the blood to drive, you're developing that gradient, drive more blood out. And the pressure inside that ventricle can get all the way up to, for this individual, 120. So during diastole, ventricular pressure was 0. During systole, it got all the way to 120. And so that means what's out here in the aorta at the very end, it gets all the way up to 120. So ventricular pressures will go from 0 to 120, back down to 0. 0 to 120, back down to 0. 0 to 120. That is on in the left ventricle. The right ventricle, the right circulation is much, much lower pressure. And in the right ventricle, during diastole, it too will be around 0. But during the peak of systole, it'll only get about 25. We're going to see that the pulmonary circulation is a much higher compliance, so much, much lower resistance system circulation, and therefore it doesn't take nearly as much pressure for blood to flow through the pulmonary circulation. So on the right heart, you're going from 0 to 25, back down to 0. 0 to 25, back down. So if the blood pressure over a cardiac cycle is 120 over 80 for this individual in the aorta, it would be like 25 over 15, 25 over 15 in that pulmonary trunk. And when you get deep into that cardiac cycle diagram, you'll understand this much, much better. And I bet many of you have already done this. So, okay, so what we have now is we have ventricular relaxation, and once the pressure inside the ventricles will relax pretty quickly. Once the pressure drops below the pressure here in the aorta, that aortic valve slams shut. So here we have a short period of time for both the aortic valve and the AV valve. They're both closed. We're in a period of what's called isovolumic, means the volume in here isn't changing. There's nothing going in, nothing going out. Isovolumic relaxation. Isovolumic relaxation.
So the difference between that and the contraction is when it's happening?
Yeah, so during isovolumic contraction, you're going from 0 up to a pressure above, in this case, 80. We're isovolumic contraction. Both sets of valves are closed. So no blood's going in, no blood's going out. So the pressure in the ventricle is greater than the pressure in the left atrium, so that will close the AV valve, okay? The pressure in the aorta is still higher than the pressure in the ventricle, so that aortic pressure is going to keep that valve closed. So you have a very brief period of time during, in systole, isovolumic contraction, generating pressure, but no blood's going anywhere. And once you get about above 80, that will cause that aortic valve to pop open, and then you'll have blood ejecting from the left ventricle into the aorta, and pressure is going to continue. You haven't finished with contracting that ventricle and pressurizing the blood. It'll drive all the way up to like 120. So, with isovolumic relaxation, there's some things, and there's some similar, some things different. What's the same? During isovolumic relaxation, right here, both sets of valves are closed. The volume of blood in the ventricle stays the same. So as this ventricle is relaxing, you know, once it dropped to like 118, that aortic valve, it slams shut. And 118 is way above 3 or 4 here, so the AV valves remain shut. So the back pressure closes the aortic valve. The pressure from the ventricle to the atria, that keeps the AV valve closed. And that relaxation is going to continue until, well, I guess I stopped right there. If this continues to relax and pressure drops to 0, then that AV valve will spring open, and then you can start filling that ventricle.
So is that during diastole?
That's going on. Diastole is once that valve springs. Yes. They have a couple questions. Yes.
So both valves are closed. How does the pressure decrease?
Both valves are closed, so pressure is very much blood and water are incompressible fluids. So here you have your ventricle with a known volume of blood in there, but the muscle is now, so the volume of the ventricle is actually increasing. So that means the pressure of the fluid has to drop. Matt, did you have?
Yeah, so I was just going to say, so the isovolumic relaxation, the only difference between that and contraction is just there's no lower pressure.
So the isovolumic contraction pressure is building. It's going from 0 to whatever it is to overcome, well, let's say in the left heart, aortic pressure. And with isovolumic relaxation, it's just the opposite. The pressure now is elevated, it was 120, and now it's dropping back down to 0.
Is there fluid in the compartment during the relaxation? Or
Is there fluid in the ventricle?
Yeah.
Yes, there is. There is blood in the left ventricle. You're going to see something we'll hopefully get to today. I'm taking quite a bit of time to cover old ground, but it seems to be fruitful. There's something called ejection fraction. That, for example, somebody may, during diastole, fill their ventricle with about 120 mils of blood. And then when they contract, they might eject 80 mils of that. So there's 40 mils left. So you never really pump it dry. You never eject it dry. Now, we're going to see with increased contractility, instead of having a contraction be left with 40, you might have a very powerful, robust contraction and end up with only 20 left. But it's never dusty in here. There's always some blood left, okay? Okay, so here's that depolarization, contraction, pressure generation, blood ejection, and here's the general things. Yes, you're going to have a course on this, but really all I want you to feel real good about and confident about right now is here's the P wave. That is an electrical recording of atrial depolarization. This PR interval, part of that delay, part of that is due to, so this is P, Q, R, S, PQRST. But you know, part of this delay is due to that small AV node depolarization. QRS complex, you have septal and ventricular wall depolarization. And then T wave, it's actually ventricular repolarization. And depolarization is going in this direction, repolarization is going in that direction, and you think, well, it should be the other direction. No, it's because it's opposite. And you can't visualize atrial repolarization. It's buried in the QRS complex for most people, so it's abysmal. But this depolarization sets off this sequence that makes for this wonderful, beautiful cardiac cycle. Yes?
Is there like a latent period that's similar to skeletal muscle, like between the depolarization?
Yes, there is built into cardiac muscle, if you look at that section, there is this refractory period, so we cannot generate another depolarization. And the skeletal muscle, I didn't ask you to go much into it, you can tell it tap. You can't cardiac muscle, you have built-in safety mechanisms, so it can't get cardiac repulsion. Okay, so here's one of the illustrations, 1214 in your book, and it's like the beginning illustration with how to start working your way into cardiac cycle. But here's those internodal pathways that Ethan, he asked for, what's the name here? Here's the illustration in the book. So that's a very efficient way of getting the polarization from SV node to AV node. But it will also cross those atria because the atria are electrically connected. There is a band of tissue between the atria and the ventricles that doesn't allow current to cross. So the atria and the ventricles in a normal healthy heart, there's an electrical barrier. The only way of getting the depolarization across is via that AV node bundle of disc connection right there. That's supposed to be the only electrical connection right there. And so this kind of shows in some photos a little bit of what I showed you in some moving illustrations. This starts getting you there and understanding a little bit about cardiac cycle. And maybe this, for some people, is the first thing to look at. 1221. When are the valves open? When are the valves closed? Now, when we were taking off last time, I said, well, there's some tricks. I love some tricks that, this is a whole lot of information. And you want to kind of look at one thing at a time, and then put it all together in real time. So what a lot of people do, and this is how when they ask me to go to the board and talk about it, I talk, well, let's just talk about the volume of blood in a ventricle. Volume of blood in a ventricle. And this cycle leads to another cycle, and it's always great to photocopy this and just draw in 2 or 3 more cycles. Just basically you photocopy and you stick them together. So, what happens during diastole? That's when the ventricles are relaxed. The volume of blood in the ventricles is building. And then the ventricles receive the depolarization signal, and then the ventricles begin to contract. And right here, the volume of blood that is in the ventricle right before contraction is called end diastolic volume. Right at the end of diastole, that is the volume. And that we're going to see, and it's in your notes, that's what's called preload. That is the volume of blood that you've preloaded into the ventricle. That's as much blood as you got into it, that cardiac cycle. And right at this point, we have depolarization, so we start having muscle contraction. And don't look up here first too much, but you can see that, oh, pressure's generating, so we clearly have ventricular contraction going on. This is that period of isoballonic contraction. Right here, the AV valve slaps shut. So right here at this very point, when the AV valve slaps shut, that's the beginning of the ventricular system. And if you come down here, you'll see that. So it's just going to take a few nanoseconds for that ventricle to contract to generate enough pressure to pop open the aortic valve. And that's what's happening right here. Aortic valve is just popped open. So why is the amount of blood in the ventricle getting less and less and less? Because it's being injected into the aorta. So as blood's being injected into the aorta, so there's this rapid ejection phase early on in systole. Blood's being injected into the aorta, so the volume of blood in that ventricle is going down. So this gets to Alex's question. Is there blood still left in here? This guy, he got up to about 140 milliliters for his end diastolic volume. He went through systole and he ejected out to about, there was 65 remaining. There's 65 remaining. So, he had quite a bit of blood left in that ventricle. Now, the amount of blood that is left in that ventricle after you get through systole is called your end systolic volume. And then the pressure has dropped enough that that aortic valve is just now slammed shut. The AV valve remains shut. So the ventricle is relaxing, 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 and this is isoballonic relaxation. And then we're back into the filling phase. So as soon as the AV valve slams shut during systole, as soon as the aortic valve slams shut, you're leaving systole going into diastole. So really know that sequence because it's so important for what's going to be going on in your patients if they have valve problems or conduction problems. You can see all this is timed very, very closely. So once you get comfortable with the ventricle filling and ejecting, filling and ejecting, you go, well, how does it fill? How does it eject? Because of pressure. Because of pressure. That ventricle was about 0 millimeters mercury pressure during diastole, and then filled. Pressure went up just a little bit. What's this little bump? That's the increase in pressure due to the atrial kick. The atria just contracted, pressurized the blood just a little bit, and now the ventricles are going to contract, pressurizing all the way. In this case, it's going up to 110. This person's, I wish they had the scale right here, but if that's the lowest as aortic pressure is, maybe that's 75. And this person's blood pressure is 112 over about 75. So the highest peak pressure during systole, that sets the top number for blood pressure, and the lowest pressure that occurs during diastole, that's the bottom number. So it's systolic over diastolic. So you will just have to step through this over and over and over again until you're very, very comfortable with it. But start with one line, get comfortable with it. Go to another line, get comfortable with it. And then take a sheet of paper and just go in real time. Okay, this is happening with volume, this is happening with pressure, this is what's happening in the aorta, this is what's happening in the ventricle. And then work through it in real time. Yes?
What's the dichrotic notch?
Boy, oh boy, everybody gets excited about the dichrotic notch. It's just the least interesting thing on earth to me. But what you're going to see is, do read it in your book, but it just happens to do with, once that ventricle is relaxing, something I was hoping to get to, but when you eject blood, into the aorta, It doesn't get like this, but it does get much bigger, and then what does it do? It snaps back. So it reflects pressure back on that aortic valve. There's the notch. That's part of it. Okay, so do look at this and spend a lot of time with it, a lot of time. Okay, so next concept is cardiac output. Cardiac output and how is it regulated? Cardiac output is how much blood is being ejected from the heart every minute. Doesn't matter in a normal healthy person if you're talking about left heart cardiac output or right heart cardiac output, because in a normal healthy person, they are the same over a period of time, over a period of minutes. Now, you're going to see that there will be some pathologies where you can have a difference of output from, let's say that left cardiac output is 1 drop of blood less per minute than what the right cardiac output is. What's being pumped out of the right heart eventually is pumped through the left heart, right? They're in series. And in a normal healthy person, right heart output and left heart output are exactly the same. But what if you have a sick left ventricle and it can't pump all the blood that's being supplied to it every minute? And let's say the right heart is pumping 1 drop of blood more per minute than what the left heart can eject. No big deal. But what if that continues and continues and continues? That's, over a period of time, leads to a whole lot of trouble. Over a period of an hour, over a period of a minute, that can make a difference of 5 to 8 milliliters. And then over an hour, that can lead to up to 300 milliliters of difference. So in this case, blood starts accumulating in the lungs, you get pulmonary edema, and bad things happen. But a normal healthy person, right heart and left heart, they're closely matched. But you're going to be spending a lot of time thinking about when they're not matched. And when they're not matched, you get edema, depending on where it is. So let's just look at the fundamental control of cardiac output. Cardiac output is a product of heart rate times stroke volume. Heart rate, how many times does the ventricles contract every minute? Stroke volume is what volume of blood is ejected with each beat. Okay? So, how do you regulate heart rate? Well, you regulate, or how do you regulate cardiac output? Excuse me. You regulate heart rate. And you regulate stroke volume. So, that's what we're going to look a little bit at. So, increasing pacemaker potential. Increasing pacemaker potential, the polarization rate will increase heart rate. So you have to look at that slide we already looked at with that slope for the pacemaker potential. Bottom line is the sympathetic nervous system, when it's activated, what does it do? It increases the slope of that pacemaker potential so you get to threshold faster. So sympathetic stimulation causes that pacemaker activity to get to threshold faster. Guess what? That increases heart rate. So if you decrease sympathetic stimulation to the heart, that's going to decrease heart rate. It's going to decrease heart rate. And do take very good looks at those figures in your book. Now, it goes the other direction. We have also ways of slowing down the heart. I've mentioned several times that as you sit here, you're under pretty strong parasympathetic tone. And parasympathetic nervous system activity slows your heart rate. So, what does parasympathetic stimulation through the heart actually do? And you know, I should back up to sympathetics. Sympathetics, you have, among other places, you have beta-1 adrenergic receptors on your SA node and your AV node. So beta-1 adrenergic stimulation by the sympathetic nervous system will increase your heart rate. For decreasing your heart rate, it's the vagus nerve innervating the SA node and AV node and also the atrial muscle. But in the SA node, what does it do? You have muscarinic receptors on your SA node, and oh, by golly, I put that in here. So here's the normal pacemaker potential, getting the threshold, and so it takes a little bit of time, but that's going to set heart rate. With sympathetic stimulation, look what happens. You have this increased rate in the pacemaker potential. So you get the threshold faster, you get an action potential, you're going to have a faster heart rate. With parasympathetics, the vagus nerve is going to be releasing acetylcholine. It's going to be binding muscarinic receptors. And I already showed you a slide, and the slide didn't work in your book, but you bind muscarinic receptors. It turns on the G protein-mediated communication to a potassium channel. It's not the type of potassium channel that you think of with action potentials. It's a very low capacity potassium channel. But what it does is parasympathetics causes a little bit of slow potassium leak. So what does it do? When potassium's leaving, it's taking with it some of its charge, so it actually will slow down. That potassium leak actually slows down the pacemaker potential. It decreases the slope, and it's going to slow down the heart rate. Slow down the heart rate. So this is what was supposed to photocopy. You got this early on when we talked about membrane signal transduction. And in the text, I made a mistake. I said that's a GS. Don't worry about what it is. It's just a G protein. So acetylcholine binds a muscarinic receptor. It activates a G protein-mediated signal transduction pathway that, instead of activating a catalytic enzyme, it opens up one of these low-capacity potassium channels. A little bit of potassium's going out. What's that doing? That is now going to slow down this spontaneous depolarization. That's what that potassium link's going to do. It's going to slow down that spontaneous depolarization. That'll slow down the heart rate. Okay, so here's a nice little illustration in your book that this kind of shows some things very simply that, yep, innervation of with the vagus nerve is acetylcholine binding muscarinic receptors that are associated with the atria. Over here with the sympathetics, we're going to see that you have beta-1 adrenergic receptors on your atria, on your AV node, on your ventricular myocytes, both norepinephrine coming from sympathetic neurons innervating those areas, and epinephrine coming from the bloodstream originating from the adrenal medulla. All those will bind those beta-1 adrenergic receptors. So vagus nerve is primarily to test atrial effects, but sympathetics, this can set heart rate, and we're going to see this sets contractility.
So those both beta 1?
Yeah, beta-1, beta-1, yeah, for the heart.
Does epinephrine always come from the bloodstream?
Yes, epinephrine does come from the bloodstream. Yes. Yep. So what's released from sympathetic neurons or epinephrine?
Okay.
It turns out they release a trace amount of epinephrine. And your adrenal medulla
Yeah.
releases something like 90% of the catecholamine it releases is epinephrine, trace amounts of epinephrine.
Okay.
So yeah, that's coming from, and both of these are considered forms of sympathetic stimulation. Okay, so let's look at how you regulate stroke volume. And you've had this kind of stuff before, but there's two major ways of regulating stroke volume. One is by the Frank-Starling mechanism. And very simply put, the more you fill a ventricle up to a point, the more blood it will eject. When you fill a ventricle, it actually helps with the overlap of the thin and thick filaments, among other things. and it will lead to a more forceful contraction. So fill the ventricle with a little bit more blood, you get a greater stroke volume. That's nice, that's built into the system. Now, you probably should put a hatch line coming down over here. There are pathologic conditions that ventricle becomes overfilled and this will actually start going down. Now, here we have that left ventricle filling to a normal resting volume. And once again, what is the volume of blood that is in the ventricle just before it begins to contract? It's called the end diastolic volume. We saw that on the cardiac cycle curve. So that's preload. The amount of blood that you preloaded the ventricle is called the end diastolic volume. That's what you loaded it. Now, what determines end diastolic volume? By far, the most important regulator of how much filling there is of the heart is venous return. If you increase venous return coming up into the right atrium, going into the right ventricle, you're going to increase filling of both over a period of a minute or two, both the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Because remember, whatever the right ventricle pumps out, the left ventricle is going to get a couple of pumps later. So, venous return is how much blood is returning to the heart every minute. If more blood is returning to the heart every minute, your end diastolic volume goes up. Stroke volume will go up. So this is an on-demand system. If something is telling your body to increase venous return, it means, hey, you need to drive more blood out of that left heart. You fill the left ventricle with more blood, you eject more on that very next beat. And better thick and thin filament overlap is part of that. Also, as you increase the end diastolic volume, so venous return regulates end diastolic volume regulates stroke volume by the Frank-Starling mechanism. That's the order. But as you increase end diastolic volume, troponin actually increases its sensitivity to calcium, and the amount of calcium that's released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum also goes up. Both those things will actually increase the strength of the contraction. Now, here is a slide. This is for skeletal muscle, and I was trying to get these to cut them out, overlay on that. But this is for skeletal muscle, but you can see when skeletal muscle is really, really short. So this is a really, really short skeletal muscle. This is optimum length. This is being overstretched. You can see the thin and thick filaments, they're not overlapping very well. And they need to overlap just fine because they need to interact to generate tension. Right here at this optimal length, there's beautiful overlap between the thin filaments and where the cross bridge heads are for the thin filaments. If you overstretch skeletal muscle, well, you have less area where the cross bridges can interact with the actin. Same thing here. Right up here would be optimal cross bridge overlap. Everything below it is suboptimal. But if that ventricle continues to fill and the end diastolic volume is too much, you can start having this type of situation in the heart. This happens during heart failure. This happens during heart failure. That ventricle is filling so much that it's losing the cross bridge overlap. Okay, so Frank-Starling mechanism, up to a point, the more you fill it with the ventricle, the more it pumps out. Contractility is the other major determinant, and it's very much associated with calcium. And what is contractility? It's an increase in strength of contraction for any given end diastolic volume. So here was that line we just were looking at, and look at something's going on here. Here we don't need to increase our end-diastolic volume, but we have a greater stroke volume. Well, this is what sympathetic nervous system stimulation will do. Sympathetic nervous stimulation will engage a number of mechanisms that makes a more powerful contraction. The more powerful and higher velocity of contraction, the more blood's pumped out per beat. So even though you're only filling it to the same level as here at the control, so in this case, you have the same end-diastolic volume, but when you're under sympathetic stimulation, you'll have a more vigorous, more powerful contraction, driving more blood out with each beat. So this is what this is showing here. So this is the contraction force over time with the control. What happens during sympathetic stimulation? There's an increased velocity for tension generation, and the total amount of tension that's generated is greater. So you have a stronger contraction and a more rapid contraction. Both of those things are going on simultaneously, causing you to drive out more blood. Now, this really does make sense, because when you have a high heart rate and you have high contractility, you need your contractions to be rapid. And this is helping make your contractions more rapid. You need to have the contraction, the relaxation done for the next cardiac cycle. And with increased contractility, not only do you have an increase in the velocity and the force of the contraction, you're going to see it also relaxes faster too. So most of, oh boy, that doesn't show up very well. This gets to something called ejection fraction. Increased contractility leads to an increased ejection fraction. And ejection fraction is simply the ratio of how much blood is ejected as a proportion of the end-diastolic volume. So let's say somebody at rest, their ventricle had an end-diastolic volume of 135, similar to what you see on that cardiac cycle, the Wiggers diagram. And that person, following the contraction, just had 70 milliliters of blood left in the ventricle. That means their stroke volume was 70 milliliters. They ejected 70 mils with that contraction. So ejection fraction is just stroke volume divided by end-diastolic volume. That meant 52% of the blood that ventricle received was ejected. Now, with sympathetic stimulation, it'll look more like this. End-diastolic volume might go up just a little bit. It might go up to 140. The end systolic volume now is 20. So the stroke volume is going all the way up to 120 mils. More powerful contraction, greater volume of blood being ejected. So the ejection fraction, stroke volume divided by how much blood was there to begin with in diastolic volume, 86%. That's a very high ejection fraction. You'll see that sick hearts, one of the things that you'll be looking at is ejection fraction. And in a number of pathologies, ejection fraction falls and falls and falls. That heart's becoming less and less efficient at ejecting the blood that's being delivered to it. So, how does contractility come about? It's similar to heart rate, that it's norepinephrine and epinephrine binding beta-1 adrenergic receptors, but in this case, it's on ventricular myocytes. And when it binds those ventricular myocytes, it does a whole bunch of different things. And this is, it leads to a more forceful, more powerful contraction. I'll show you the slide. But just as important, it increases the strength and velocity of the contraction. It also increases the velocity of relaxation. This is very important. If you want your heart rate to be high and strong and fast, not only do you need to have a rapid contraction, you need to have an equally rapid relaxation. And that's built into the system, thank goodness. Okay, so this is the book's diagram, and this is actually the best diagram I've seen. I used to make these things up. I saw this, oh, this is it. So norepinephrine and epinephrine binding the beta-1 adrenergic receptor on a ventricular myocyte. It sets off a GSG protein, adenylate cyclase, cyclic AMP pathway that we've already talked about. So cyclic AMP is going to activate protein kinase A. Protein kinase A will go out and phosphorylate a number of things. One thing it will phosphorylate is that L-type channel. And remember that L-type channel, when action potentials goes across that membrane, the opening of that L-type channel allows some calcium to come in. Guess what? This allows more calcium to come in, and it can come in faster. Calcium coming in will then bind this ryanodine receptor on the sarcoplasmic reticulum membrane, and what does that do? That springs open this calcium channel. This is also phosphorylated, and it makes this channel more sensitive to calcium, and it stays open longer. So bottom line is more calcium from the extracellular fluids coming in, more calcium is being released from sarcoplasmic reticulum. We're going to have more rapid cycling of the cross bridges. So increased force and increased velocity of contraction. And not only that, there's actually going to be a change in well, that's not what it also changes the calcium ATPase exchange, or excuse me, the calcium ATP pump. So during diastole, during relaxation, you get your calcium back in your sarcoplasmic reticulum even faster. That leads to a more rapid relaxation. Do look at this table. Well, look at all your tables and all your figures. But this really looks at autonomic effects on the heart. And so as far as sympathetics via these beta-1s, yep, on the SA, no, they're going to increase heart rate. At the AV, no, they will increase conduction velocity. Remember, conduction velocity is usually really potent. Sympathetics will actually speed it up a little bit. It will increase the contractility of both the atria and the ventricular myocytes. Now over here with the parasympathetic stimulation, as far as heart rate, it will decrease heart rate, and it has no effect on the ventricles at all. Parasympathetics don't affect the ventricles at all. Most of its activity is associated with the atria. This is the way the book kind of shows what's going on during sympathetic activation and how can you regulate cardiac output. You don't know this yet, but sympathetic stimulation will cause your veins, your inferior vena cava and your vena cava, stiffen up, have a decrease in compliance. And what does that do? That drives blood to the heart. That increases venous return. Yes?
The last figure that you were on, well, 2 figures ago, I guess.
Yes.
This one, this is just sympathetic stimulation.
Yeah, this is just showing sympathetics.
So what is the mechanism for parasympathetic?
For parasympathetics, it has nothing to do with ventricular contractility. This is ventricular contractility. Parasympathetics, nothing. All parasympathetics is really doing is decrease. All I care for you to know is it's decreasing heart rate.
Okay, and it's using the cholinergic neurons and binding to a
Muscarinic receptor, opening that potassium channel, decreasing the slope of the pacemaker potential. You've got it. You've got it. Okay, didn't want to finish. Well, take a look at this. This is showing all the different ways that you can regulate cardiac output to get it to go up. And these things happen vice versa. If sympathetic activity goes down, that will go down. If end diastolic volume, all these things, if it happens in one direction, you withdraw the stimulation, it'll go in the other direction, okay? So, I will see you next week.